In January 1973, inside a quiet hotel room in Paris, diplomats signed a famous treaty that promised peace to a weary world. Publicly, American leaders announced that the long conflict in Vietnam was finally over and that honor had been restored. But behind closed doors, a far darker reality was taking shape. President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger had created a secret mechanism made of private promises and hidden assurances. South Vietnamese President Nguyen van Thieu initially refused to put his pen to the paper because he knew the treaty was fundamentally flawed. The agreement allowed over 100,000 North Vietnamese soldiers to remain inside South Vietnam's borders. Thieu recognized that signing the Paris Peace Accords without strong guarantees meant accepting the eventual downfall of his country. To break his stiff resistance, Nixon began sending a series of confidential letters directly to Saigon. These secret communications were kept entirely hidden from the American public and the United States Congress. Nixon wrote directly to Thieu with direct and repeated pledges, promising total military protection if the North broke the treaty. The letters explicitly guaranteed that if North Vietnam violated the peace, the United States would react with full force, bringing American air power back into the sky over Vietnam. Yet inside the Oval Office, American officials knew those promises were impossible to fulfill. The American public was deeply exhausted by years of heavy casualties and political strife, while Congress was already drafting laws to halt all future military action in Southeast Asia. Nixon was offering guarantees he had no legal authority to enforce, using secret diplomacy to secure a temporary political exit. Henry Kissinger worked tirelessly to manage the diplomatic mechanics of the final negotiations, ensuring the deal went through before public support collapsed entirely. He understood that the terms placed South Vietnam in grave danger, but the immediate priority was securing the withdrawal of American forces. The entire peace process rested on a foundation of deliberate ambiguity, hiding the reality of the situation from lawmakers on Capitol Hill. Relying on these explicit private pledges, President Thieu finally agreed to sign the Paris Peace Accords in early 1973. American forces quickly packed up their gear and withdrew, leaving the South Vietnamese military to defend their borders alone. Thieu genuinely believed he possessed a sacred commitment from the highest level of the American government, and he built his national defense strategy around the expectation of fast American military intervention. The reality on the battlefields of South Vietnam was far different from the hopeful news reported in Western newspapers. North Vietnamese forces did not retreat as the treaty required. Instead, they reinforced their forward bases and expanded their logistics networks. The peace accords had not created true stability. They had merely removed the primary shield protecting South Vietnam while leaving enemy divisions stationed deep inside its territory. Back in Washington, the domestic political landscape was quickly consumed by the Watergate scandal. Secret tape recordings revealed widespread abuses of power, causing Nixon's domestic authority to disintegrate month by month. As his political power dissolved, his capacity to carry out private foreign policy assurances disappeared along with it, rendering the secret letters in Saigon useless. By late 1973, Congress moved decisively to prevent any renewed military action by passing strict legislation that limited presidential war powers. Lawmakers restricted funding for military operations across Southeast Asia, effectively closing the door on any potential return of American combat aircraft. Nixon was trapped between his hidden commitments to Saigon and the firm legal limits established by an unyielding legislature. In Saigon, military commanders watched with growing alarm as enemy units tested their defenses with increasingly bold military actions. Whenever remote outposts fell to attack, Thieu sent urgent cables to Washington, calling for the immediate air support he had been promised. The responses from the American embassy grew distant and vague, revealing that no help was coming to save them. When Nixon resigned from office in August 1974, Gerald Ford assumed the presidency and inherited the secret record of those confidential assurances. Ford discovered the secret Nixon-Thieu correspondence tucked away in executive files, learning the full depth of the commitments that had been made. However, Ford faced a hostile Congress that was completely unwilling to approve new military funding or reignite the conflict. Without American support, the South Vietnamese Army suffered from severe supply shortages as Congress reduced financial aid. Soldiers were forced to ration their artillery shells and rifle ammunition while holding the line against a heavily armed opponent. Economic distress crippled combat readiness across every military sector, slowly draining the morale of forces who felt abandoned by their primary ally. The North Vietnamese leadership monitored the political deadlock in Washington closely and concluded that the United States would not intervene under any circumstances. In early 1975, they launched a massive military offensive in the Central Highlands to test the resolve of the weakened defense forces. Without American air power to turn the tide, South Vietnamese lines fractured under the intense pressure, triggering widespread panic. In a desperate effort to save his army, President Thieu ordered a sudden retreat from the northern provinces to consolidate defensive lines around the capital. The movement quickly devolved into a chaotic disaster as thousands of fleeing civilians mixed with retreating military convoys along choked highways. The loss of critical territory shattered what remained of the country's military cohesion and organizational control. Inside the presidential palace, Thieu spent his final days reviewing the secret letters from Nixon, coming to a painful realization. He had trusted private guarantees that were never legally binding, relying on personal promises that had been washed away by political reality. The diplomatic deception was fully exposed, leaving his government entirely alone as enemy forces closed in on the capital city. In April 1975, with enemy artillery striking the outer defenses of Saigon, Thieu resigned from office and delivered a fiery farewell address to his countrymen. He brought the secret Nixon letters into the open light, publicly condemning the United States for failing to honor its written commitments. He revealed to the world how private assurances had lured his nation into a false sense of military security. Days later, as American helicopters evacuated personnel from rooftops in Saigon, enemy tanks burst through the gates of the presidential palace. South Vietnam collapsed completely, bringing a sudden and dramatic end to the Vietnam War. The rapid fall of the Republic demonstrated the devastating real-world consequences of built-in diplomatic deception and unfulfillable promises. Declassified intelligence transcripts and unsealed documents later confirmed that top American planners knew the risks from the start. The record shows that key figures realized South Vietnam could not survive long without continuous American air power. The secret correspondence had served as a temporary political bridge, buying time for an American departure while shifting the ultimate burden onto Saigon. The saga of the secret Nixon-Thieu correspondence stands as a powerful case study in the dangers of hidden statecraft and deceptive diplomacy. It reveals how informal commitments made outside constitutional channels create impossible expectations that vanish during a crisis. When international agreements rely on secret mechanics rather than genuine national policy, the resulting failure is paid for in human lives. Decades after the final evacuation, the unsealed files continue to illuminate the cold logic that governed the end of the Vietnam War. The Paris peace accords were celebrated publicly as a moment of reconciliation, but the secret letters formed their fragile and hidden foundation. The archival record remains a stark warning of how paper promises can mislead an ally and shape the permanent fall of a nation.